Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Aleyn Smith-Gillespie. I'm a director at the Carbon Trust, and I'll be talking briefly about what are the decarbonization drivers that are important for the business agenda. I'd like to briefly introduce the Carbon Trust in case some of you don't know us. We have been working with business and governments and technology providers across the world for over 20 years on the climate agenda and on helping achieve the net zero. And our mission is indeed to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. We're a mission-focused organization, and it's a real pleasure to be talking to all of you here today. I'd like to start off by giving an overview of what are the many drivers that companies have to take into account when it comes to decarbonization and achieving net zero aims. These range from growing policy and regulation on this area, investor scrutiny and changing investor requirements, around improving the resilience of supply chains, and also taking into account a number of other increasing drivers that companies are seeing with regards to requirements from buyers and consumers, changing technologies, and also the wider set of stakeholders that companies need to address, including employees and wider society. There's a number of initiatives that are important to acknowledge in this area. Of course, the action that's happening at the regulatory level in the EU, but also industry initiatives such as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, which is really driving the transparency and scrutiny of company and corporate action on climate. To give the wider context of why we're talking about this, it's because global action is required to stay within a cap of 1.5 degrees temperature rise. And in order to do that, the world needs to achieve net zero by 2050. For that to happen, we effectively need to be on a trajectory globally to halve emissions by 2030. So this really sets the context for what we all need to do, and that is being translated into corporate action and corporates meeting the similar trajectory as well. Net zero and the net zero agenda is being adopted increasingly by policymakers around the world. It's important to note that the EU climate law has now placed net zero at the center, making it binding for the region to achieve net zero by 2050. The UK has had a target for 2050 enshrined in law for a number of years now, and action is growing across key geographies where net zero targets have been set and are being set and committed to across a number of time horizons. So that provides a regulatory backdrop to what companies need to be doing. From the corporate's perspective, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, is the organization that globally is setting the standard for what it means for a company to be achieving and committing to net zero. They have defined what is called science-based targets of what a company needs to do in the near term and the long term. To date, over 2,500 companies, many global organizations have committed to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and requirements. And of that, 800 have already committed to setting net zero goals. So there's an increasing expectation that companies need to take action, and increasing scrutiny of who is committing to that and who isn't. The Science-Based Targets Initiative has defined what a pathway looks like for a company. This is an illustration on the left of what that trajectory should look like in the near term and also all the way through 2050. The near-term targets effectively mirror what the global requirements are in terms of reductions. The long-term targets require reducing towards net zero by 2050 at the latest. Effectively, that requires a 90% reduction in emissions between a baseline year and the 2050 target year at the latest. One of the biggest areas of challenge is going to be achieving those reductions in so-called Scope 3 emissions, so the value chain emissions. These targets are required for Scope 1 and 2 organizational emissions, but also Scope 3 as well. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are typically a lot more visible and understandable to a company, and the areas and levers for action are reasonably understood, whether it's through improving and investing in energy efficiency, operational efficiency, or adoption of renewable energy for electricity requirements. In some cases, investment in technology will be required, where there are especially important thermal processes involved in a company's own operations. But the biggest challenge lies in Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are divided into upstream and downstream emissions. Upstream emissions is effectively, a lot of it is around the supply chain. Downstream, a lot of it is around how products are used and what happens to them at the end of life. So given the challenge of Scope 3, it's important to think about what companies need to do in order to plan ahead. And that's illustrated by the importance that Scope 3 has in terms of the overall emissions that a company needs to deal with. This graph illustrates Scope 3 emissions, blue upstream and pink in the downstream, and puts them in relation to Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is the green you'll see in the middle. The key aspect here to acknowledge is the importance of Scope 3 overall, and supply chain in particular for many companies is going to be a challenge. So what does a company need to do in order to address this? This will be looked at in some detail by other speakers, but at a high level, companies need to be planning ahead for this. They need to be thinking, what do they need to invest in, and how to especially decarbonize any growth between now and target years, whether it's a midterm target or a long-term target, and what kind of actions need to be taken. So essentially, the message here is investing in future decarbonization and looking at how that needs to be achieved. Typically, there's going to be an innovation gap, which is effectively uncertainty about where decarbonization needs to come from. What are the levers that companies can apply? Well, these range from actions that can drive incremental efficiency improvements and actions that are going to be more transformational. Incremental efficiency will include engaging with suppliers, supply chain to drive the same efficiency that a company needs to do for its own operations, but pushing that up downstream. The more transformational actions will need to look at fundamentally the types of business models that companies employ, the types of products that companies buy, looking at circular business models, circular sourcing, so looking at the materials that procure, looking at much more sustainable materials. Those are going to be big transformational areas of action that companies can take. Importantly, there are going to be three axes of actions that companies need to address. One is ensuring effective measurement, knowing the starting point, and to report improvement against that. Looking at key actions, such as the ones we just looked at, and financing that. So those three areas of action are going to be important for all companies to address in their strategy and in their planning. Measurement, effective measurement, decarbonization action, and financing that and working with partners across the board to enable all that to happen. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the panel discussion.